get it to the computer. Today we're talking about play. Now, let's be honest, folks. As adults, we spend most of our time pretending to be important, as if somehow there's a need to be serious as grown-ups. Now, yes, there is certainly a time and a place to be serious. In fact, if we look at the current climate and the environment and what people are dealing with, there are a lot of really important and serious issues. But there is a paradox that when we let go of the facade of this serious importance, there is a way that we can create from a place of play that allows real magic to happen. And I'm really delighted today to have Jeff Harry here with me, who's an expert in the power of play. I certainly have noticed for myself in the last week that when I have the experience of thriving and things are flowing, and I know that might be a spiritual term, but quite frankly, I can't think of a better way to describe it, that I have this experience of play that things just seem to get resolved even if they are really serious. So before we get into chatting with Jeff, I just really want to celebrate and showcase some of his expertise. Jeff really is an expert when it comes to helping and showcasing, to help organisations and individuals see how major issues in the workplace can be solved with play. He was selected by Bamboo HR as one of the top HR influencers of 2020 to watch. He's been featured, and his work on play has been featured on CNN, CF Chronicle, SoulPancake, and AJ Plus, which I'll have to get him to explain to me what that actually is. Jeff and his colleague also have worked with Google, with Microsoft, Southwest Airlines, Adobe, the NFL, Amazon, and Facebook. And his mission really is about how to infuse more play into our day. So, and by the way, he has, as an international speaker doing conferences globally, he was actually a guest and speaker at our very own Australia's Pausefest, which is fabulous. So I am going to get Jeff to share with us a little bit more about that. But firstly, Jeff, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So where shall we start? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and I suppose the work and the passion in the area of play and how that came about?
Sure. So do you remember the movie Big with Tom Hanks?
Yes, I do actually.
So I saw that when I think I was like 8 or 9 years old. And I realized there that I was like, oh, you can get paid to play with toys? And at that very moment when I found that out, I started writing toy companies. And I didn't stop writing toy companies till I was 16. I would send them, I had a word processor.
Sorry to interrupt you. Writing as in you were sending them letters? Is that what you're saying?
I was literally sending them. I would get on my word processor and I'd write these letters. And first they were letters like, hey, can you hire me? Super short, and then I get nothing back. And then I'd write these long letters with all of my toy ideas. And because I was writing it on a word processor, I don't think they realized I was a kid. So I would get these template letters back that are like, thank you, but we are not interested at this time. We are not hiring. And I would get these over and over again. And I was like, I want to make toys for a living. That is what I want. I want to play for a living. That's ultimately what I saw when I saw Big. And then I eventually worked for the toy industry. I worked for some toy companies like Sega, and I was like working for Toys R Us International. And I hated it. Because I was sure it was going to be fun. But when I arrived in the cubicle, as you know, it is a soul-sucking place where nobody's playing. And you're like, this would be the place where people would be playing. There's toys everywhere. Why is no one touching any of these? And then I left and I was like despondent. This was in New York. And I moved to the Bay Area and worked for another toy company thinking that would be different and the same result. And then I eventually was just lost. And I was like, what am I going to do with my life? And then I found this organization that had 7 people at the time, and they were playing with Lego, introducing kids to engineering. And I just did that because I was like, oh, I want to play with Lego for a living. And then I was with them for the next 15 years. And grew it to 400 people, and we taught like over 1 million kids about STEM when STEM wasn't a thing. But the thing that drew me to that, and why I've now created Rediscover Your Play, was it was an opportunity where I was able to create a world for kids to play and realize who they could become. And that is what was so powerful. And then eventually, when I started running workshops for adults and corporations and things like that, what I realized with a lot of adults, their issue is that they forgot how to play. They forgot how to even tap back into their inner child. And many of them were like, besides playing with my kids, I don't really know what that even looks like. And I was like, that's so sad. And also a huge reason why we are having trouble addressing major issues in the world. I need to create this work.
So I do want to try to understand that a little bit. So two things that you said, there was a transition for you where you were working in an organization where you were working with youth and you were actually having them see opportunities and really, you know, what they were going to be up to. But then there was a transition you mentioned about how then you started doing the workshops for organizations. I just want to understand that transition and what was going on over there with you. What was the opportunity you saw? Because you know, like, and I say this because, you know, in the area of doing workshops for one group of individuals, where you see an opportunity, no doubt there are considerations about, well, what the heck is that actually going to look like if we have a bunch of adults sitting in the room who,
Right.
given what you just said, are not used to playing and were not in touch with their inner child. Can we go back to that time? Tell us when was that exactly, and what was going on there?
Sure. So I think it was 2010, 2011. I was helping out with the Obama campaign. And then I came back and was helping Play Well, the organization was at the time. And I was working with Visa. Visa reached out to us. It was like, hey, do you run these things, these workshops for adults? Because we had been running so many of them for kids at these companies. And being that we embrace our playful, method, I was just like, oh yeah, sure. Like, yeah, of course we do. And I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Let's go. And we just made something up. And I remember making it on the fly with a bunch of my colleagues. And we were like, they were taking marketing. They were taking the marketing department and the engineering department. And they were having them meet together at like their manager's house, which was super weird. And it was, how do you have the engineers understand the marketers and how the marketers understand the engineers? And we put them in this simulation where like the engineers had to focus on aesthetics and the stuff that was outside their comfort zone. And the marketers had to focus on like the mechanics and the design, and just taking people and playing with their roles and kind of messing with the situation. And then just being like, let's see what happens. We're just here to facilitate what happens, but then we'll see what they want to talk about and observe that. And that's where we went from there. And that was how I've approached all organizations. It's like, what is your issue? What are you challenged with? Oh, you're siloed. Oh, you have communication issues. Oh, there's power dynamics. All right, let's play with that in a playful way and run this simulation in a safe environment where you can take risks. And then we can have harder conversations in a safe, comfortable, but challenging environment.
Brilliant. So firstly, what I really loved about one of the things I loved about what you just said was the willingness to just do it, say yes to doing it, and then being in the curiosity of what that was going to look like without having it solved out. And I'm interested in your perspective actually about that, because I think we're really in a period of time where traditionally, certainly in my generation, I mean, maybe the same for you too, that, you know, it was actually quite the opposite. In fact, most people, and I'm a strategist by in my background, right? So mostly it was very structured. Organizations were very structured. You would set what the vision is. You'd have a very clear idea of what the goals and the targets are. You'd map it out. You'd do your financial planning and blah, blah. But it really was a lot more around certainty, right? So be certain about what you're doing before you do what you do. But I think certainly from what you're sharing, and also I do think not only in the current climate, but I think in the last 10 years, what we're seeing is a bigger movement towards letting go of the need for certainty and being able to play, as you call it, or be curious and be willing to see what happens with the safety in the back. You know, like it's safe. It's safe to play. It's safe to screw up. It's safe to fail. But are you, in the work that you're doing, are you noticing that that's actually potentially what's sticking about the work you're doing?
Yes, I think it's also, I also challenge the idea of how has the myth of certainty, you know, how has that worked out for you? Because if you look back on your life, if everyone looks back on their life and looks at the path, it really, most of the time, it doesn't make sense. It makes absolutely no sense. Like, it's like this ping pong ball, and you would have never mapped it out that way. You would have never mapped it out that way. And every one of your like clear plans, imagine everyone in January and what your plans were. How are those plans working out for you right now? How are they doing? What are we doing with those? You adjusted them a little bit? How's that going on? Like,
Yeah.
this is what this time has been, is it's challenging our own BS, in my opinion. You know, it's challenging
Beautiful.
our own lies of like, well, if I plan out my business strategy and I lay out these things and I make these certain steps, and then I'm definitely going to make this type of revenue. Are you serious? Are you serious right now? Like, how many of you had like 50 speaking engagements all scheduled up? Now they're gone. What are you going to do? Guess what? You're going to have to play with this. You're going to have to maneuver, and you're not going to, and this is the part that I keep challenging people to own, is like, you don't have any clue what you're doing, but nobody does. No one ever did. And the part that frustrates me the most is when someone is super successful and then they make a webinar, they sell like 1,000, you know, hundreds of thousands of books, or they make some like course and they're like, this is the way. If you do it my way, then you'll be successful. It's like, no, it worked for you. Glad. And maybe it's going to work for some of you, but don't tell everyone this is the way. Like, it's different for everybody, and everyone's trying to figure it out as they go along. And you didn't know what you were doing until you got to the top. And now you're telling this fake story about how you were a hero when you weren't. You weren't. You were just as lost as all of us. Let's just admit it. That's all I'm saying.
I've got to try and regroup myself. Sorry. I just love that. I mean, you know, I don't know if it just happened to be 2020, right? When you were saying that thing about, oh, and by the way, you know, look, I just want to frame something. So firstly, before I want to come back to this because I do want to say something, but at the same time, I just want you to know that I think this is a perfect example, Jeff, of how to be able to have a sense of humor and play in a conversation with being considerate or acknowledging that in the background, this doesn't mean that anybody's life's perfect by any means, or that your life has to look a certain way. And you may be dealing right now with incredibly intense, difficult situations, because that's what happened pretty much come January anyway. But and look, let me present no illusion here. I think many of us, you know, even myself, you know, like the financial stability in the current climate is difficult. So I just want to presence that, not to take away from the humor or anything that's here, but I think it sheds light on something to say, you know, the experience of play and being able to laugh and have a sense of humor and take a very curious approach to this stuff is really possible, no matter really what's going on out there. So I just wanted to presence that. And I do want to come back to what you said, because January 2020, it was, I don't know if this was, you know, how many people did we see, including myself, I might add, that at 2020, this is my year. This
It's
is
2020.
year.
2020.
I'm going to plan my engagements and blah, 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 you know.
It's going to be the best year ever.
Best year ever.
Because 2019 was horrible, but now 2020.
That's right. Bad year last year. This is going to be great. And even now, I mean, you guys in the States, I mean, how are you going over there actually? Because massive, I mean, I can't even, I'm just speechless actually. How's it going over there?
Well, it's a disaster. Let me not just, you know, and I mean, it's both a leadership disaster, Um, and I'm not even talking about just the president. I'm just talking about in general, like what I just wrote. I'm writing an article right now about how most women leaders have been able to save and reduce the amount of lives lost due to this pandemic. But when you look at male leaders, especially in the US, is the lack of empathy and the lack of understanding and the lack of leadership and the cowardness of how they're making decisions. And like a deer in headlights, they are putting so many more people at risk. And it's challenging because you have that happening, and then you have the whole challenge that we're having around racism and the issue around Black Lives Matters, which I'm more and more heavily involved in, because we are now being challenged to have hard conversations. And the idea of using play to do it is really actually important. I just was running a conversation. It was called, white guy and black dude have a awkward conversation about race and racism. And it was like we were playing in that, even though it was a difficult conversation, and how do we both show a certain level of respect towards each other, but also not just skimp and touch on the tip of the iceberg, but actually go in depth and identify our own unconscious bias. I recognize the own institutionalized racism and how we're feeling about it, and also owning the fact that neither of us have the answers, but we're trying to figure this out together.
Yeah, beautiful. I do want to, given the reference that you said to leadership, uh, what do you think that, when you say that, what are you referencing there?
Who are the types of people I'm referencing?
Well, when you said there's just a real leadership crisis, when you say there's a leadership crisis, what is the reference to leadership in your opinion?
Well, if you're asking me who I'm referencing, the leaders is that the question you're asking?
Oh, either who, or I suppose when you see, when we talk about leadership, I think there is often, when we even hear that, there is a default to thinking we're talking about someone in a certain title,
right?
That's where we kind of automatically think.
Right.
In the context for this, certainly the intention here is we want to kind of take that away so that we can talk more about what we're actually talking about when we talk about leadership per se.
Yeah.
So I'm interested because when you mention, when you look at what's happening over there for you in the US, there is a disaster, and you said there is a concern around the leadership. When you're referencing leadership, what are you either referencing? What are you looking at? What do you think it should look like? What's the thing that's not working about that?
Right. Yeah. So that's a great question. So I'll give the best way to answer it is I'll give you an example. So we have two governors, right? We have one governor in Florida, a man, and we have another governor in Michigan. It's a woman. The one in Florida reopened way too early. He was one of the first states to reopen. Opened with no plan, so there was no clear understanding from restaurants and all these different places what you should do. There also was no clear explanation to the citizens how they should act. And because of that, huge spike in cases, huge spike in deaths, hospitals are overwhelmed, and he doesn't want to close. And even at one point, fired some of the medical examiners because they wanted to reveal higher COVID contact rates and higher death rates, but he was trying to hide those numbers. So just so he could keep the economy open. That was his chosen type of leadership. Then you have another governor in Michigan, female governor, who has kept the state closed for the most part and only slowly started to phase in certain businesses, and has gotten such a massive amount of backlash, and so many people being like, you're destroying my business and you're destroying the economy and you're ruining everything. And she's been staunch because she's like, lives matter more than money. Lives matter more than the economy. And I understand some of your arguments, but a lot of the people that are asking to reopen right now are people that are asking to reopen so they can get haircuts, so they can go to restaurants, so that they can go to the movies. All these things where you are getting served by others, so you are putting other people in situations. I am choosing as the leader to not put their lives at risk, and I will put my position in jeopardy in order to save lives. And that is what I mean by a true leader, a strong leader.
Yeah,
Like
it's
the
beautiful.
like the leader in New Zealand. Like
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly, exactly. And you know, I think there is very similar cases here in Australia as well. But I think you do raise a very, I think, poignant, about leadership itself, and that leadership is ultimately about people. You know, when I think where the decision that you was referencing is the decision to consider the impact it was having on people, with not just thinking about the commercial benefit. Of course, we do have to have both in mind, but at the same time, lives really do matter. And I think that's a really great way to frame leadership, really, is like, you know, you really got to put lives at the heart of that. Let's go to an example of specifically the work that you do with leaders in organizations, because, you know, let's be honest, leaders are often the ones, and I'm not discounting myself, being in an organization in a leadership role where you got to be serious. But, you know, you do get there, and there is this facade about looking like you got to have it together, and especially when we're announcing massive redundancies. And, you know, Qantas here, as you would have heard, have had to just make another announcement of thousands of layoffs, right? And I was working just before this all happened. I was actually working with them, and it was the same conversation that came up with leaders there, that even though they know there's a disaster and they are feeling it, and most of the time their stress levels are really very, very high, they would say, yeah, but we have to make sure people don't see that about us, because we have to at least let them know. Now, there is validity in that, right? Because you want to ensure that people feel safe, that they're not at risk. But at the same time, how does one then embrace the things that you're teaching? So I'm interested in you hearing an example from you about where you've worked with an organization or a group where you really have seen that shift from, you know, a group of leaders who have potentially got a certain way around the way of operating, and they've broken down the barriers and they've adopted what you've done. Have you got one that you can share with us?
Yeah, there's a few. I was working with a company where it was so blatant. We were running a workshop, and it was actually at a winery of all places. And we were doing a play workshop, and we were building something at the time. And I think it was the leader of that team at one point told everyone to stop and come in, and was like, "I'll take care of it. I'll do everything. Everyone else just stand back. You're just messing things up." Um, and he was like, "I'm an expert. I'm the expert of Lego. This is the reason why I'm doing this." And then everyone was like, "All right, we'll just go drink wine." So like you had all these people drinking wine while this person was building on his own, as
Really?
if this was like I was back in like teaching kids again. And then afterwards, when we processed it, it was just like, well, why are you doing that? How did that help? And just him being aware and realizing that not only he was taking up space, but was cutting off all these people's ability to not even join in, but share their expertise, was so blatant in a play setting that had probably been playing out for many months, if not years, but only then was it so obvious, right? You know, another example. So Gary Ware and I, we run this workshop called the Dealing with A-Holes at Work workshop through play. Dealing with A-Holes at work through play.
Can we bring that to Australia?
I did. We brought it to Pausefest. That was the
Beautiful.
workshop we ran at Pausefest, right?
Yeah.
We also ran it at Inbound in Boston. And first off, the makeup of the people that showed up was hilarious, because in Inbound, I think we had like 100 or so people there. 90% of them, who were they? Were they men or women? What do you think?
Oh, well, you're not going to tell me men, are you? Oh, come on, I'm a woman here. I shouldn't be going pro women on everything. That's not fair.
10 dudes! 10 dudes! When we were at the...
Oh,
and when
10
we were,
dudes.
only 10 dudes showed up! Only 10. And when we were at Pausefest and we ran
Of
the
course,
same
because they're not assholes. Is that right?
Right.
So they
Right.
don't show up because they're clearly not?
Well, they were the only ones willing and humble enough to go in there knowing it wasn't a safe space for them, but they were
Right.
brave enough to be like, I'm going to be in the minority. When we ran this at Pausefest, we started off with, I think, 8 or 9 men in. By the time we ended, 4 left, only 4 left. But like, that is just, it's the reality of like, we're going to have a difficult conversation. We're going to put people in situations where you are going to confront the a-hole at work. We're going to simulate this, literally simulate it through play, having a hard conversation, what you would say, what the person says back, you know, like sharing. I mean, when we were doing it at Pausefest, people were in tears, people were angry, people were laughing, but they were going through all the emotions because they were like, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only one that quit my job because my boss was an a-hole. I thought I was the only one that felt like I couldn't speak up because they were taking up 90% of the space in the room. And we challenged people in that workshop and the leaders there that be like, hey, that Steve Jobs, Rockefeller, whatever approach you've been doing is antiquated and done. Like, it's done. You're going to be obsolete if you do this. You can hold on to power for maybe 5 or 10 more years, but guess what? It's eventually going to end for you because it ends badly for any a-hole, because then you end up building by yourself because no one wants to hang out with you anymore. And Gary and I even made a video about the brilliant jerk, choosing the team over the brilliant jerk. The brilliant jerk makes a ton of money for you, but what does it do? It destroys the team. Even the US military has realized that we will pick the team over the most talented individual we have any day because it's about the team. And just like my reference earlier of the governors, it's, are you putting the team first? And if you're not, you're going to be done. Your organization's going to be done. Your team's going to be done. And you'll be wondering what happened.
Love it. I really love that. You know, I'm going to confess something here to you. So one of the things that I'm very upfront about when working with people is I say, you know, the thing that gave me the greatest amount of power was when that I could own that I was the biggest a-hole on the planet. You know, I think that, you know, because at the end of the day, I mean, we all have, as a human being, you know, we all have a brain, and the brain's designed to operate in a certain way. Like if we treat it just like an engineer and a piece of machinery, that machinery, whether we know it or we have a conscious level of awareness to it or not, the brain functions in a certain way. And one of the things that does happen is we judge and assess. Now, we judge and assess ourselves, we judge and ourselves others, we judge and assess life. We judge in order to try to make sense of the world. And that's a survival mechanism from a, you know, a part of the brain that we've had for you know, well before humanity. And it wasn't until the development of the prefrontal cortex that we were actually able to establish awareness to that kind of stuff. So by default, every one of us is an a-hole, right? Let's just be honest. If we actually took the lid off and you could actually see what was occurring in most people's conversations in their own head without the opening of the mouth, there is a lot of judgment going on. And I think that's why I really love the concept of that workshop, because I do think that when we can all own our own a-holeness, in
preach right there.
Oh my God. Well, when we do, right? I mean, there's a profound sense of connection, because at the end of the day, Jeff, as I'm sure you would see this time and time and again by the time you get through those workshops, at the end of the day, it's like people end up wanting to hug each other because they fall in love with each other. And when they actually get to get rid of all of that bullshit that's sitting in the front ground, is that not what you know?
Oh, that's absolutely it. I mean, actually, one of our pillars is, after you address, you know, your a-hole colleague, or you have to address your a-hole boss, you eventually have to address, and this is going to sound weird, but your internal a-hole. You have to address, you have to address your inner critic, That is the meanest person. I run a whole other workshop just on inner critic and how do you play with your inner critic, because you got to own those thoughts and be like, are those thoughts my thoughts? Or is that like my childhood self telling me something that I didn't get over when I was in 3rd grade? And because if you don't address that, you go to the next organization and then those same triggers from somebody else happen because you haven't addressed your inner critic, your inner a-hole. And yeah, so I completely agree.
Thank you for bringing that whole workshop distinction up. I love it. I especially love it because one of my talks is around the A game. And I've never had the A-hole in it, actually, ironically, because it's all about other stuff. But, you know, the A game for me is around acknowledgement, accountability and action, right? But I love that you've got A-hole in there because I think it's a perfect fit and it adds to the A's. Now, I do want to, normally what I like to do in these conversations as well is bring it back to a bit of a personal perspective in your experience and your journey, framed around the fact that we talked about leadership and about what leadership really is about making sure that our attention is on people and that lives matter. So I've got a couple of questions I want to throw at you. One is, in your journey, what would you say has been, and I do get this is going to be a very difficult question, but because there's probably a lot to this one, but in your journey so far, what would you say has been one of your proudest accomplishments? Personally.
I don't know. I've had a few.
Yes.
One was when I took that organization that was only 7 people and we grew it to something that taught 1 million kids, you know, in the span of a decade. I never thought that was possible. And then then I just was able to just create all of these crazy events and workshops, like all over like the country, and then eventually, you know, in other parts of the world. That was really amazing for me. But I think a bigger accomplishment for me, and this is going to sound, well, I'll just say it.
Yeah, great.
I found my voice. That I think is one of my biggest accomplishments. And what I mean by that is, like, I think everyone, when you're creating, is you're constantly trying to figure out, what is it that I want? And a lot of times you're creating for others. You're trying to people please. You're trying to, you know, get validation. And there was a moment, and I don't know when, and Elizabeth Gilbert says this, which I love. She says, you know, she's rarely seen anyone ever get through personal transformation until they get tired of their own BS, their own bullshit, right? And there was a moment when I was like, you know, I just don't care what others think. I'm just going to create. Like we had no business plan when we started a lot of the areas that we started. We had no plan when we would create a brand new workshop, because a lot of times companies would come to us with something brand new and unique. And they were like, hey, Google came to us and was like, we have, you know, people that work all over the world managing food for their 40,000 or now 100,000, you know, employees. What should we do? How do we not silo when we're frankly in a silo? We would have to figure that out on the spot. And it's this idea of just feeling confident that I'm going to figure it out. Not that I have all the answers, but that I have faith and a belief in myself that I will get through this. And I heard this from, like, my sister has a best friend who's a prolific writer, and wrote a lot of amazing books. And when I asked her what was it about her writing that she was certain that she was going in the right direction, and she was just like, it's just experience. The amount of reps that I've done making this book, I now hear my inner voice, my inner child, my inner self enough that I have a moral compass that I trust myself that I'm going to eventually get there, that I'll eventually wrap this book up. I just know it, even though I don't know how I'm going to get there. And that is the play part. That's the whole, it's ironic to me when people are like, oh, our company never plays. How did your company start? It started by trying to solve a problem and having no idea how to do it. and you brought in a bunch of people and you were creative and took a lot of risks and failed miserably and you figured it out. When did you just let go of that and become all serious, you know, and feel now you have to like cater to, you know, your stockholders and not still embrace the thing that got you there in the first place? So that is the challenge that I ask organizations.
Yeah, right. Well, what I'm hearing is the paradox of knowing and being that you know, and at the same time letting go of that you know anything. Right.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you. I really love that's beautiful. The second question I have is around what about the and again, there's probably going to be a number of them. But what would you say is the first thing that comes to mind when you look at one of the biggest obstacles that you've come up against, overcome, and then the lesson that you learned in that?
I think one of the biggest challenges I had to learn, and I had to learn this early on, is as a leader, you can't do it all, which means you have to let it go. If you want to empower others, I believe a great leader is someone that builds leaders. So if you aren't building leaders, you're not leading. If you don't have people that are phenomenal underneath you, if you're picking weak minded people or people that you can control, then you are in and of itself a weak leader yourself. And at first I was, because I would pick people because I was like, well, I want to hold on to my power. And then I was like, well, I can't build this way. I can't scale this way. So this ability of being able to grow other leaders and then let go of the work that I built, that is so hard. You've built this baby, you've built this area, you've built this company, and then you got to let it go to somebody else. What if they screw it up? What if they destroy it? I would have never done it that way. You're like, oh, they're going to do it that way? That's a horrible way. They're going to fail. And but being able to be like, yeah, it's going to be okay. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And then realizing when they're successful, hey, guess what? It wasn't all about you. There were more ways of doing it than just your way, Jeff. Check your ego. That was one of the biggest challenges, and also one of the biggest successes when I was able to do that. You know, when I was able to humble myself and be like, I'm part of something that's much bigger than me. And then this is not about me, even if I'm in a leadership role. And I feel leaders that are like, I have to be strong, I have to be this. They are making it about themselves. And if you want to lead in this time where it's so precarious and there's so many unknowns, you need to lead with a certain level of transparency and a certain level of vulnerability. And if you can't, it's because you don't want people to lose sight of that image that you have built. And you have to let go of that image if you want to truly lead in this unknown environment.
Yeah, beautiful. Now, one of my other questions was actually going to be to complete a sentence about a leader is someone who, but you actually answered that in your last question, which is fabulous. So the thing, I mean, as always, my experience with these things, I could talk to you for hours on this topic. But to complete on the conversation, what I would like us to end on is, you know, globally, you guys are probably hit the worst, really, in the current situation, right? And given the timing of these things, and I think the real importance of the work you're doing, especially now, I want to put the spotlight on just specifically, given that where you're at right now and what you know to be true for yourself and for the people that you work with, you know, yourself and Gary, and what it's like for you on a day-to-day basis. And if you were to look at that and talk from what it's like for you, what can you see that is some of the greatest principles, I think, in your work, and what are you drawing on right now to bring to light your work on play to help you through this current situation?
I'll answer it this way. I just ran a workshop where we talked about flow. The doctor of flow is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, that's his name. And he, does positive psychology, and he speaks a lot about flow. And it's this idea. He has this chart of skill and difficulty of the challenge. Does the challenge and the skill meet? And when they meet in this diagonal way perfectly. But when you have a very little skill, you have a ton of anxiety, a huge amount of anxiety, right? And then when you have a very little challenge, but you have a lot of skill, you're bored. You're frankly bored. But there's a moment when the challenge and the skill meet perfectly in this flow alignment. And that is the part that I am encouraging people to try to fall into as much as possible, is this idea of challenging yourself to be fully present in this moment, to listen to your inner child or your inner voice and what it's telling you to do, to follow that creative pursuit and follow that curiosity. And even this with organizations, and see what is possible. I know somebody that works for a Fortune 500 company that was like, no one is talking about racism and Black Lives Matters at my company. I'm going to put together a talk and we're just going to talk about it. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, but I'm just going to do it. And she did it, and it started to change the organization, right? You know, I have a friend who's unemployed, has no idea what she's going to do next with her life. She started making TikToks just because she wanted to. Now she has so many followers that if she wanted a job tomorrow, she could be like, hey, I need a job. Can someone help me out? And her TikTok followers would help her out. It's this idea of you have to play in the flow. You have to do things that make you feel like alive. Like there's a famous quote of like, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is for more people to come alive. Do that. Do that at this point. Follow that curiosity that makes you come alive, and do that and see where that goes, because that flow will provide you so many answers and so many more opportunities. And you know, this might sound like, you know, like fluff, but for a corporation, it's the same thing. You have to find your flow with your organization, be open to many more opportunities and ideas, not just use the word pivot, but actually challenge yourself and your organization to really define what that looks like. Let go of that image of like who you used to be and own what you want to be next. And that is a really difficult process to do. So if you own a play-oriented mindset when you do it, when you own the idea of riding the roller coaster and enjoying the ride, you're so much more likely to come up with a lot of amazing solutions.
That is such a beautiful way to end the interview. Thank you for joining me today, Jeff. Thank you for making the time. And I'm looking forward to actually expanding on a lot of this in the conversations over the next couple of months around play. In fact, I certainly might throw the challenge to a lot of my guests to find out what they're doing to take on board your tip around play. But thanks again for joining us. Anything else you want to say to close off?
Yeah, I just made this video, but I'm challenging people that don't know what to do next. They're like, I have no idea what to do next in my life or whatever it is. And I've asked them these two questions. And I'm asking them to ask their friends these two questions. I asked them to go to their friends and ask them, what value do I bring to my life, bring to your life, right? So this idea of like hearing what, like a lot of times you don't know who you are, so you hear it back from your friends. What value do I bring to your life? And then secondly, ask your friends as well as yourself, what makes me come alive? Because when you answer those two questions and you have them reflected back on you, it provides you all this amazing content in the sense of like, this is who I am. I didn't even know this existed. And that's super powerful for a lot of people that are like, I'm not feeling a lot of love right now. Go ask your friends those two questions and you will.
Okay, so let me just make sure I get that clear. Firstly, go ask your friends, what is the value that I bring to your life?
Yep.
Yep. Second question is, what is it that makes me come alive?
Yeah, when you see me fully, what is it when you have seen me most alive, most present, most having fun?
Yeah.
Yeah. And to see what their answers are coming back. And that opens up all these doors.
Fantastic. Thanks again. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.